Hello, citizens, and welcome back to Histories and Mysteries Redux, where we are talking about the Exodus. This is part 7, where we talk about Jericho and the conquest of Canaan. What is Histories and Mysteries Redux? I've taken some of the Histories and Mysteries classes that I've taught at the church and I'm rerunning them here. I've modified their content to make them better for this online environment. And in this case, there are 9 classes. That's right, 9, dealing with the Exodus. And of course, we're on class number 7 right here. Feel free to go back and find the earlier ones if you missed them. Let's pretend we're at church. Grab your caffeinated beverage of choice. You're probably going to need it. Pretend it's Woody's Fairtrade blend. That's pretty good, Joe. Take a seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion. Look to the whiteboard for the terrible dumb joke. For a church, it's on the left side of the classroom there. In this case, it's on the bottom. Okay. Sorry about that. As this is a Christian education event, we have to have a passage to lead off with. This is from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 29 through 31. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land, but when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had received the spies in peace. On to the much dreaded agenda. We're going to do the opening prayer. We'll go over some caveats and disclaimers. Then we're going to go over 3 key concepts: geography and the people of Canaan, some brief reminders about previous episodes where I talked about the difficulty of archaeology, and we're going to talk about the rules of war in the ancient world. Then we're going to do a brief review of the story of Joshua, very brief, some of the miracles that occurred around Jericho, and then the conquest of Canaan. So buckle in, here we go. The opening prayer. If you know it, say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. Our main caveat: the goofball teaching this class is just a geologist and only knows dirt, rocks, and water. All other information is suspect. You have been warned. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, but there's going to be geology, a lot of geology. A reminder that the sources for these classes are The Miracles of the Exodus by Colin J. Humphreys, The Parting of the Sea by Barbara J. Silvertson. For basic Egyptian ancient history, it's The Great Courses by Bob Breyer, The History of Ancient Egypt. And for the new chronology material by David Rohl, here's a list of the books and the videos that explain the new chronology. And again, for the purposes of this class and all my classes, when I'm talking traditional, I'm talking about based on religious text or religious tradition. So the idea that this is the traditional understanding according to the Bible. And when I'm talking about conventional understanding or conventional history, that's based on current academic consensus, as if you could actually get a bunch of academics to sit around and actually come to a consensus during this day and age. But that's what I mean, traditional versus conventional. And we are on the 7th class out of 9. This is Jericho and the Conquest of Canaan. I got 2 other classes to look forward to here. So let's start with the geography of Canaan, this land that is being invaded by Joshua and the Israelites. In context, it is part of the Fertile Crescent, that area of land where the climate and the abundance of water allows you to actually have agriculture that can sustain a developing civilization. So the Fertile Crescent extends from Upper Egypt down the Nile River to the coast of Palestine or Canaan, into Phoenicia and Syria, and then down along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the area called Mesopotamia. We call this area the Fertile Crescent because it's crescent-shaped, and they call it fertile because of agriculture. Or south of the Fertile Crescent, desert. North of the Fertile Crescent, much harsher terrain. Now, if you're going to have communication between the two imperial centers, one being Egypt, the other being Mesopotamia, you have to have some kind of trade routes or highways or mechanisms by which to get from one to the other. And we have a series of trade routes, and they're listed here or shown here in this map in yellow. And they basically run one up along the coast. The Romans called it the Via Maris. And then one that goes on the east side of the Jordan Valley, known as the King's Highway. And these are the two major trade routes that go through the region of Canaan or Palestine or the various areas on their way between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Why are these two routes the way they are? It is dominated by the geography of Canaan. So here, this three-dimensional relief map, the relief is highly exaggerated to make it stand out. But you have the coast, the coastal plain here on the western side of modern Israel. We now refer to this area as kind of like the Gaza Strip and portions along that line. Up here is a little area, the Jezreel Valley, where Megiddo is. Then you have the series of hills, one of which is dominated by Jerusalem up in this area right here. Then you have the Jordan Valley that starts to the north at the Sea of Galilee. Then the Jordan River flows through the Rift Valley into the Dead Sea. On the other side is another set of hills, and then out into the desert, out into the west. So if you're actually going to travel from one north to the south, you're going to be wanting to travel along the easy way of the coast, or you're going to want to travel the flat, easier way on the east side of these hills. All right, so that's the general topography of Palestine. So when Joshua and the Israelites show up, the Exodus ends here at Heshbon, and this is where Moses gives his last sermon, sings his song, all the stuff that you find at the very tail end of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And then he dies, and leadership passes over to Joshua, who then leads the invasion into Canaan. Now, the exact route of his invasion and what cities he conquered is up to debate, because there's a certain amount of disagreement within the text of the Bible. Some portions say he attacked one group of cities, some portion says he attacked another. But in terms of geography, the Israelites come up the east side, then they go across to Jericho, and then they travel up and down the hills on the west side of the Jordan to do their conquering and invading. So let's take a closer look at Jericho. Jericho is on the west bank of the Jordan Valley. It is there because there is an oasis, a spring that supplies a constant source of water. Through up and down the Jordan Valley, we have many streams that come in called wadis. These are intermittent streams. They tend to only have water in them during certain times of the year. And other times of the year they're dry. And there's just not enough water in many of these streams to actually sustain a continuous development of civilization. There have been times in the past when the climate has been wetter and these streams had enough water in them to support a town or a city for a time, but then as the climate dried up, those towns and cities went away. But not necessarily at Jericho. Because of the spring and the constant supply of water there, Jericho is one of the oldest continuously occupied locations in the Middle East, all the way back to the Stone Age. Now, if you are Joshua and the Israelites, you are on the east side of the Jordan Valley, and you have got to get across the River Jordan, across the valley, to attack Jericho on the west side. The actual ancient city of Jericho is known as Tel es-Sultan. Now, Tel is a giant hill, a hill made up of ruins, as layers of city get built upon the ruins of previous cities. So the Tel of ancient Jericho is called Tel es-Sultan, and it's located very close to the spring, as you would expect. This ancient Jericho has been occupied as far back as maybe 10,000 BC or more. Again, because it's been supplied by that continuous source of water. And the most thorough excavation of this site was conducted by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. We'll talk about this at least just briefly again later in the presentation. Her findings is that the city was surrounded by a thick set of walls during various times of its occupation. The Bronze Age walls were collapsed and cracked, and the city was destroyed in some kind of destruction event around 1500 BC. Now, if you actually started to use radiocarbon dates for some of the soot and ash that's been found in that destruction event, they push it even further back in time to 1575 BC. Conventional scholarship associates this destruction event with a particular Egyptian campaign where the Egyptians were raiding up and down Canaan at that time. And after this destruction event, apparently the ancient city of Jericho was not reoccupied again until after 1000 BC, when you start getting into the Iron Age. So here's an artist's reproduction of the ancient Bronze Age Jericho prior to its destruction event. You had large, thick walls with mud brick houses and a palace complex within the city itself. So let's take a look at what the text says from the Bible. This is Numbers chapter 13, verses 25 through 29. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word with them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, "We came to the land of which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the north of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." So these are the peoples of Canaan as described in the Bible. So actually, let's take a look at how these people might have been distributed based upon biblical text. So you have the Philistines. We know of them there because they're in an area called Philistia, or the Philistines, a series of cities down here. This is the root name for Palestine, as Palestine was named later by the Romans. Then you have the Jebusites, who lived in the hills around Jerusalem. The Hivites, the Perizzites, all these other different types of Canaanite peoples. But this is a weird one right here. We see them up here. We see Hittites here, and we see Hittites there. And if we were to extend this map out, you would see Hittites in other locations scattered up and down the entire coast of Syria and Phoenicia and Palestine and Canaan. The Hittites. Who are the Hittites? Well, in this case, people argue that these are small Hittite civilizations that extended out from the mother Hittite civilization that is in Anatolia and Turkey. Now, we call these people here Hittites because they're named such in the Bible, but they used the same kind of script as was used by the Hittites in Anatolia. So in actuality, we call the Hittites in Anatolia because we found their writing to match the writing in these locations that have been traditionally associated with the Hittites according to the Bible. And it makes a lot of sense because at one point in time the Hittite Empire was very, very large. We knew it was based in Anatolia. We could see the archaeological remains of Hattusa and their big cities and their script and their language, and we get a record of their conflict with Egypt and their association and communication back and forth with Egypt. But after the Bronze Age collapse, which traditionally occurs long after the Exodus, but after the Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire disappears, and then you have a new series of states or small countries scattered throughout Syria and Palestine, which we call the Neo-Hittites. Mostly we call them that because apparently they use the same language, the same script, and worship the same gods as the Hittites did up in Anatolia and Turkey. And some people argue that these Neo-Hittites are what are referred to in the Bible, and that there were really no Hittites per se in the land of Canaan during the invasion of Israel. So what do we actually really know about Canaan? Well, we know that based upon the information that we find in archaeology and from the texts that we can pull from Egypt, where there had been invasions, that there was no overall kingdom in Canaan. It was all a bunch of independent city-states. And each of these city-states tended to be walled because they're constantly at war with each other. And that it is something of a heterogeneous mix of cultures. That the folks who lived in Philistia, in the land of the Philistines, were quite a bit different than the folks who lived up further north and in the hills around Jerusalem. At least that's based off of what limited archaeologic information that we have. What I've got here is an actual aerial photo of Ascalon, which is one of the Philistines' city-states. And we get a lot of information from the Philistines from the archaeological work that's been done at Ascalon, including where the palace complex was, the walls, things along that line. Based upon the archaeology, we get some sense of what Canaanite religion is, but we also pull from texts like biblical texts and other texts where we can find them in Mesopotamia to get a sense of what Canaanite religion is. We know it was polytheistic. The primary gods in Canaanite language appear to be El and his wife Asheron, but there are also other important gods, Baal and Moloch. Now, based on the archaeology, a critical component of Canaanite religion is that many people, at least wealthier families, apparently had small shrines to their gods, the gods that they happened to be patrons or believers in, set up within their homes. And that there, some point of time, somebody was actually making idols to be housed in these small local household shrines. Beyond that, we've got the biblical texts, and you can make some inferences about Canaanite worship based upon that biblical text. So, Canaanite worship, we understand, based off the Bible, involved sacrifices, specifically at high places, the tops of hills. That if worshippers of Asheron erected what were known as Asheron poles, think of them as similar to being some form of totem poles, to mark their worship locations. The Bible infers that there is temple prostitution occurring as part of the Canaanite religion. Temple prostitution is found in other texts in other parts of the Middle East as well. There's a close association between the kings and the gods that they choose to worship. Many kings will have their names associated with a specific god. And if the king succeeds, it's because their god and the religious choices they made were strong. Their god is strong, so on and so forth. And if they fail, it's because they did something to upset the gods, their patron gods, who they chose to associate themselves with. And as we look at texts that we do find in other portions, kings as polytheists believe in the power of other gods. So a king may elect to worship Baal because he believes that Baal is strong, but that does not necessarily negate the power of other gods. They may be strong too, and it's only by battle and warfare or other forms of struggle can show which god is the mightier of the gods involved in this contest. Now, when you actually get away from biblical text and actually look at the archaeology, you have household idols and shrines. The gods of Canaan are very similar to the gods that we find in Mesopotamia. And because of, I mentioned before, the Hittites, there's a lot of influence of Hittite religion, apparently. When you start looking at the images and the texts and some of the names and some other aspects of worship with Hittite religion. There is much, much less influence from Egyptian religion. We see very little that can be tied back to the traditional gods and polytheism of Egypt. Now, as I had previously mentioned in previous classes, and I suggest you go back, everything I just discussed in terms of archaeology is got gaping holes in its reliability. Archaeology is hard, and it is often very inconclusive, and all it takes is one or two other finds to upturn everybody's conclusions that they're basing everything on up to this point of time. And so everything that you got to view from archaeologists has to be viewed with a certain degree of skepticism and suspicion that not that they're wrong, but that the amount of evidence that they're using to reach their conclusions is quite minimal. So lastly, let's talk about the rules of war. The rules of war are actually spelled out in Deuteronomy. Here's Deuteronomy 20. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. But if it does not submit to you peacefully, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord has given you. A little further on. Thus shall you treat all the towns that are very far from you, which are not towns of the nations here. But as for the towns of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God. These rules of war seem to us just to be crazy harsh. Yet if we look at other civilizations and how they conducted warfare, they're almost typical of the kind of rules of warfare that were conducted during ancient times. The Assyrians were markedly noted for the cruelty of their attacks and the cruelty they showed to people who refused to acquiesce when they besieged towns. They impaled and spiked and cut off heads, piles of skulls, and they did all of that deliberate cruelty to ensure that the next town they went to would be scared to death and give up without a fight. So the rules that we are dictated in Deuteronomy seem very, very harsh to us, yet they're about the same as what's being conducted by other folks during ancient times. So now that we've talked those concepts, let's get on to the main show here. So let's go for a very, very few second brief review of the book of Joshua. Moses dies, Joshua takes over and leads the Israelites. He starts in Moab, east of the Jordan Valley, takes over that area. Then he conquers Jericho. Then he invades the south, and then he invades the north. After the conquest, the land of Canaan is then divided amongst the 12 tribes of Israel, each of which is named after one of the sons or associated with one of the sons of Jacob. So let's step back to the conquest of Jericho. Joshua, chapter 2, book 1, Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, Go, view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. Let's talk about these spies. Joshua sends 2 spies. They make a reconnaissance. They cross the river Jordan. They came to the city, and they're protected by Rahab, whose house happens to be located on the city walls. When the men are detected, Rahab hides them beneath stalks of flax on the roof, and then points the pursuers in the wrong direction. Convinced that Jericho will fall to Israel, Rahab requests safety for her and her family in return for her help. The men give their promise, and they tell her to tie a rag or a flag on her window to exemplify or notify the Israelites where her house is, and then they escape and report back to Joshua. Now let's look at the text for chapter 3, where we cross the Jordan River. When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were in the front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap, far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing toward the sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel was crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark on the covenant of the Lord stood on the dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing the Jordan. Now let's go to the walls of Jericho, Joshua 6:15 through 17. On the 7th day they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to this people, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. So, can we explain any of those things with science? Turns out you can explain the Jordan River crossing with science, and in fact, it's actually occurred in historic times. 1927, where an earthquake set loose a landslide near the town of Adam, the same town as mentioned in the text. Now, landslides can dam rivers, as was the case in 1927, where the Jordan River was dammed by a landslide. So the landslide comes down, this big mass of dirt blocks the river, creates a dam. The river starts stacking up behind the dam, and the water south of the dam or downstream from the dam continues to flow on to where it goes, leaving relatively dry. Eventually, the pressure builds up above the dam. It's not like an engineered structure. It's just a pile of dirt, a landslide. Starts to erode away the dam breaks, and then the river gushes back down in a large flood. This is almost exactly as described in 1927 historically, is described almost exactly as what happened in the Bible. And so this is the simplest, easiest, and with historical precedent of what actually occurred in the Bible. So wait, you argue, you're in a desert. Okay, we're going to get in a little more into the weeds of landslides here, just like these two British geologists are in the weeds above a landslide with coastal erosion in England. Okay, it turns out that water is the big issue for landslides. Landslides are more prevalent in wet areas where there's lots and lots of water because saturated soils are weak soils. Water adds weight to a soil and detracts away from its strength. So as a result, a saturated soil is a weak soil and more prone to becoming a landslide. And Israel is not exactly wet, but it does have a wet season. For example, the Jordan River was flooding above its banks according to the Bible. And yes, the Jordan River does on occasion actually flood, as it did in 1937. Now, we have other portions of the world where we have major landslide type events that occur in arid areas, and they occur with a great deal of frequency. And the leading example from our nation is the area around Los Angeles. And in this particular picture, I'm showing an area east of Los Angeles where you see a lot of scarring in the hills where landslides have occurred, mass wasting of soil, where all this rock and soil and debris has shed off the hills and then it piles up in the stream areas. So this giant mass of wet, sodden debris just flows down the stream channel and will eventually deposit in a fan or lobe at the base of the stream. And it could be something like this that maybe had occurred during the Exodus that might have then deposited a lobe or fan of debris into the Jordan River and then blocked the river. Maybe. These type of events, though, are not typically associated with earthquakes. They are typically associated with large storm or rain events. They're also, the biggest ones are associated with volcanoes. If you want to watch some amazing videos, type into YouTube, debris flow, Mount Pinatubo, the Philippines. And it's just some of the amazing debris flows that they had coming off of Mount Pinatubo after its eruption. And what about the walls? These masonry walls of ancient Jericho. Can we explain their collapse, their sudden collapse? Well, that's actually quite easy if you start talking about an earthquake. So maybe an earthquake caused the landslide, just as it did in 1927 that blocked the Jordan River. Earthquakes often occur in swarms, aftershocks, foreshocks, etc. Maybe another earthquake just knocked down the walls. Now, wait a second, you say, is that even possible? Well, the walls were constructed of brick, and these types of walls are actually very susceptible to earthquake damage. For example, the Bam earthquake that occurred in Iran in 2003. This was a major earthquake of 6.6 magnitude. And it killed roughly 26,000 people. At least 26,000. The exact death toll is not known because all of these mud brick buildings that the entire city was built of just collapsed. And mud brick is heavy, and it collapsed on people, and people trying to shelter inside buildings died as the entire building just shook apart and fell down on top of them. But to give you some idea of the context between the survivability of mud brick architecture and more modern architecture, in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake in California was a larger earthquake, 6.9 in magnitude, and it only killed 63 people, and also caused, by perchance, well over 1,000 landslides across the area. So, we can explain at least that portion by science, earthquakes and landslides. I'm sold, aren't you? What about the time frame? Well, this goes back to some of the stuff we've been discussing in previous classes. So traditionally, the Exodus occurred at 1446 BC during the reign of Ramses II. The conquest of Canaan is 40 years later, so it would be 1406 BC. Now, if you look at the destruction event at Jericho, that's at least 100 years after archaeology identifies the destruction of Jericho. To add further complexity, conventional dating puts the reign of Ramses II in 1250, which is over 300 years after the destruction event of Jericho. Because none of these dates seem to line up, conventional academics tend to discount the entire Jericho story as being a legend or mythology and having absolutely no historical veracity. So how can we make this work, or at least attempt to make this work, time frame wise? Tradition says, according to the Bible, the Pharaoh at the time of Moses' birth did not know the Pharaoh of Joseph when the Israelites came into Egypt. The Israelites had become very numerous in the land of Goshen. The Israelites then became enslaved by the Egyptians. One Pharaoh died and was replaced by another while Moses was away in Midian. So let's take a look at our conventional timeline again for Egyptian history. You have all the way back in, say, roughly 3,500 BC, your pre-dynastic period. And then you get your early dynastic period, your first legendary kings of Egypt, like the Scorpion King. And then you have the period, roughly speaking, around 2650 BC, something around that time, where the Old Kingdom period starts, where the two Egypts, Upper and Lower Egypt, Northern and Southern Egypt, become joined as a single kingdom under a single pharaoh, and you start pyramid building and the first true dynasties, so on and so forth, the Old Kingdom. Then we enter a dark age around 2125 BC, where we just know almost nothing. We call that the first intermediate period. And at the end of the first intermediate period, we get the middle period, starting around 1975 BC, where the kingdom gets established again under a single pharaoh. It's all unified again. Then the second intermediate period starts around 1630 BC. And during this time, there is a lot of the kingdom is disunified. There are different pharaohs to the north. There's invasion of a people called the Hyksos. There's Semitic people living up in the northern parts of Egypt who have established their own kingdoms, their own dynasties up there. And all of this chaos ends in around 1539 when the New Kingdom period starts. And again, Egypt is unified under one pharaoh. And it will stay that way until the Assyrians and all kinds of stuff bad. But we're not going to focus on those later times. Let's instead focus on this second intermediate period because it just happens to conjoin best with that traditional timeline. So we know that the 14th dynasty was actually a dynasty of kings or pharaohs, or however you want to call them, of Semitic-speaking people who lived in the Nile Delta area, that is the land of Goshen. The 15th dynasty, the pharaohs are associated with people called the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos have been interpreted as being sea peoples or foreigners or maybe Semitic-speaking peoples. There's a lot of argument as to who the Hyksos were. Now, as these two dynasties, the 14th and the 15th, were going on, concurrent with them, or the 16th and 17th dynasties, these are the Egyptian dynasties in southern Egypt or Upper Egypt, based out of the city of Thebes. And in around 1550, that time frame, Ahmose kicks out the Hyksos and unifies all of Egypt. And this intermediate period, where we have this kind of time of chaos and rival dynasties and rival cities and very little text, makes a nice break in the history to allow for a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So again, let's look again at this time frame, this intermediate time frame, starting roughly around 1630, ending roughly around 1539, 1550, this period right here. It's a time of chaos and disruption, of which we just don't know a whole lot about it. So if the Exodus actually occurred during the second intermediate period, maybe they were fleeing from a Hyksos pharaoh. Then you can get the Israelites to show up at about the same time as the destruction event at Jericho. And it helps that we know almost nothing about the Hyksos pharaohs. So it makes it a whole lot easier for us to say, the pharaoh was a Hyksos. And that's why he doesn't line up with any of the other traditional pharaohs. Because we got a group of pharaohs we just almost know nothing about. Let's take a look at what ancient historians say. Ancient Greek and Roman historians associated Pharaoh with Ahmose I, the one who took over all of Egypt and reestablished a unified kingdom, the founder of the 18th dynasty, the founder of the new kingdom. Why do they associate him with the Pharaoh of the Bible? Because Egyptian texts say that he's the one who kicked out, removed, got rid of the Hyksos. And many of these ancient historians associate the Hyksos with the Israelites, the ancient Israelites. And date-wise, it's kind of close. So some of the arguments we've had about Ahmose I, he's again the pharaoh who expelled and defeated the Hyksos, who many historians have associated with the ancient Israelites. The argument against Ahmose I is that he had actually a long and prosperous reign. He didn't die drowning in a flood event trying to cross the Red Sea. And he actually conducted invasions and raids into Canaan and Syria, which we see no indication of in biblical texts. Also, the biblical texts say that the Israelites were building the city of Pi Ramses when they were enslaved. And we know that Ahmose I did not build Pi Ramses. That was Ramses II who built that city. And presumably, he actually wiped out the city of Avaris, which is the city that lies next to and underneath the city of Pi Ramses, the capital of the Hyksos dynasty. So before we dig ourselves any deeper into this trying to figure out time and chronology, let's get a list of all the cities that Joshua conquered. Now the problem we have is that different parts of Joshua indicate different cities were conquered, but we'll look at this more comprehensive list right here from Joshua 12:9 through 23. The king of Jericho, the king of Ai, which is next to Bethel, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, the king of Gezer, the king of Deber, the king of Geder, the king of Hormah, the king of Arad, the king of Libnah, the king of Adullam, the king of Makkedah, the king of Bethel, the king of Tupuah, the king of Hepher, the king of Aphek, the king of Lasharon, the king of Madon, the king of Hazor, the king of Shimron Meron, the king of Achshaph, the king of Taanach, the king of Megiddo, the king of Kadesh, the king of Jokneam in Carmel, the king of Dor and Naphath Dor, the king of Goim in Galilee. That's 31 kings in all. 31 cities are listed here as being conquered by Joshua. So that's a lot of cities. Surely when you actually go and start looking at all of these locations, there's an archaeological record that indicates this kind of invasion. Well, the record does show that there's destruction events in many of these sites, but the dates are not firm and they don't appear to align real well with each other. But some of them, in fact many of them, are around-ish that 1500 BC mark. However, I had mentioned previously that you had all of these raids and invasions by Ahmose I. And so, when these destruction events are found in Canaanite cities around 1500 BC, they are commonly associated with Ahmose I, including the destruction event at Jericho. But there's another alternative that we have discussed previously, and that is the new chronology. Yes, we're going to look at this again. Remember him, David Rohl? We talked about him in a previous class. You can find his work here. I put up the list again. The new chronology is based on the identification of the biblical pharaoh Shishak, who conquers Jerusalem, as being Ramses II, and not, as conventionally agreed upon by academics, as being Shoshank I, the pharaoh who made the Bubasite portal and actually documents in that portal conquering Jerusalem. To make that work, to make the biblical Shishak match Ramses II, you need to push up the conventional chronology or push back the traditional chronology. And what Rohl and his associates are doing for the new chronology is they're doing for both. So for that to work, he pushes the reign of David and Solomon out of the early Iron Age and into the late Bronze Age. And what's appealing about this is that when you start looking at late Bronze Age archaeology in Canaan shows a thriving civilization, a large civilization, lots of people, lots of interesting things going on in cities. Whereas in early Bronze Age, you find almost none of that. The new chronology also means that the Amarna letters that are in the archive in the city of Amarna in Egypt would have recorded the wars of Saul and David. In fact, he would identify, Rohl and his associates would identify the Israelites to the Haberu as described in those letters, and it sounds an awful lot like, oh my gosh, these are people who are conquering and taking over, just like Saul and David were doing during their times as reigning kings of Israel. This pushing of the timelines pushes the Exodus into alignment with the early Bronze Age destruction levels at these Canaanite cities, like the collapsed walls of Jericho. And it pushes Ahmose I out of the picture. Ahmose would be a completely different time frame, couple hundred years after the Exodus event. Now again, we got to go back and look at Kathleen Kenyon's excavation. As typical for archaeological excavation, she did her excavation in the 1950s, and it took them almost 50 years to actually put together the definitive report of that excavation. It was published almost 50 years later. Now, they found these Bronze Age walls and the evidence that the city was wiped out around 1500 BC. And again, they also found that Jericho was occupied all the way back to 8000 BC. So the other way to make this work then is you challenge the dates. as concluded by Kathleen Kenyon during your archaeological excavation. In other words, you argue that Kathleen Kenyon got it wrong. This is the method used by many evangelical websites who argue for the traditional time frame. The date in the Bible is correct. The destruction event at Jericho lines up. The reason that Kathleen Kenyon's date does not line up with the traditional Exodus date is simply because Kathleen Kenyon's date is wrong. I'm the teacher. I get the final word. If the conquest did happen, then the evidence, or lack thereof, indicates that it occurred around, I would argue, 1550 BC. This would align with the Exodus occurring around 1600 BC, in the middle of the intermediate period, probably under a Hyksos pharaoh. And that's a generalization. But since I'm just a geologist, and the only thing you can rely on me to know is dirt, rocks, and water, let's look at what some other folks are thinking in terms of alternative theories of the Exodus from the realm of academia and the realm of crackpots. That's the next class. Until then, here's a kitten praying for your soul. All right, I'll see you next time. Thanks for stopping by and listening. We really appreciate it.